Today's podcast of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror. Audible has over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. Welcome to episode 6.1. This is a companion piece to episode 6, which is about the creation and history of shock theater and horror hosts. It happens a lot when you're creating podcasts like this. You have hundreds of great ideas, but they just don't make the final cut. When it seems like there's still more story to tell, I make an Addendum of Doom. This one is called Close Encounters of the Horror Host Kind. Now, the thing that fascinates me the most about the phenomenon of horror hosting is that it is still going on today, because the horror hosts and shock theater shows were creations of a very specific time in television history, which no longer exists. In fact, those conditions haven't really existed for about 30 years. And yet, the horror hosts never completely went away. Of course, one would expect guys like Sven Gulli and Count Gore-Duvall to keep going in whatever way they could. They had very popular television shows that got canceled. But what really interests me is the group of people who grew up on these shows and then decided to become horror hosts themselves, despite there being no real home for them. I mean, why do that? Well, it's love. It's passion. It's obsession. My kind of people. My first close encounter with modern horror hosts happened in the early 2000s when I went to WonderCon in San Francisco. It's a pretty big convention. When I went into the huge dealer room, I found a long table with local celebrities behind it. I ended up calling it Horror Host Row. I was given a rare treat. Bob Wilkins from Creature Features was making a rare appearance. Even though I grew up on the East Coast, I knew about Bob Wilkins from my readings, and I had watched some video snippets of him online. He was legendary to me, even though I didn't grow up with him as my host. What I didn't know was how rare my meeting with him was to be. Bob was entering the late stages of Alzheimer's by then, and he wouldn't be with us much longer. That day he seemed clear, and he had his usual self-deprecating humor. He also did what he always did, toss the spotlight on others. He led me to John Stanley, who took over Creature Features when Bob left. There was also a host named Dr. Goldfinger, who had red and green lensed horn-rimmed glasses. I also met Miss Misery, the queen of horror in the Bay Area. She was dressed like a punky version of Morticia Addams, and she had horn-rimmed glasses. And she was much younger than the other hosts. It would be hard to think that she was even born before Creature Features was off the air. When I spoke with her, it was apparent Miss Misery was a force to be reckoned with. She had a horror host show called Movie Massacre that ran on local cable channels. But she also ran The Last Doorway show, which showcased independent horror artists and their movies. And then I met Mr. Lobo of Cinema Insomnia. He was dressed in a black suit and looked almost normal. Something was a little left of center. Perhaps it was the fluorescent green striped tie he wore. Mr. Lobo was older than Miss Misery, but he was still too young to have been a horror host back in the heyday. What really caught my eye about his stuff was the fun graphic design of his posters. They had kitschy mashup of like the old TV Guide logo and 50s bowling alley lettering. There was this great cartoon eye that he had and a slogan that made me laugh. That slogan was, "They're not bad movies, just misunderstood." I found out that at that time, Cinema Insomnia was nationally syndicated and broadcast on over 30 television stations. Holy shit, these guys were doing this for real, and I knew nothing about it. I found Cinema Insomnia on TV, and I watched it that week. The show started with a fun intro that used slick 50s retro graphics and clips from old B-movies. Then we see Mr. Lobo. He sits on a yellow rocking chair. Behind him is just black, nothing, nada. It's a void. The only other set decoration was an end table with a phone and a potted plant that we find out is named Miss Mittens. Mr. Lobo introduced himself and then proudly announced the famous big-budget movie he was about to show. Then there's murmuring off camera, and a hand holding a note comes into the frame. Mr. Lobo grabbed the note and sighed in disappointment. He meekly explained that he couldn't show the big-budget movie due to his own show's budget constraints. And then he announced the movie that we were really going to watch. Basically, it was a staple of all these shows, something in public domain. However, Mr. Lobo said this movie needed tender loving care, not ridicule. He said we needed to take the cinema insomnia oath before the movie would start. A spinning hypnotic disc was brought out, and Mr. Lobo pried open his eyes with his fingers and told the audience to repeat the oath with him. The oath was to watch the movie, the whole movie, and nothing but the movie. I loved it. Mr. Lobo made the limitations of his zero budget work for him. The lack of any set design made your eyes go directly to him, and the show was either going to sink or swim on his comedic timing and his charisma. Both Mr. Lobo and Cinema Insomnia were self-aware and witty, but they didn't resort to easy jabs at the movie. Both Miss Misery and Mr. Lobo were creating their shows without a broadcasting studio budget, without an actual studio to shoot in, and without a large movie catalog to rely on. A lot of times they were only armed with movies in the public domain, and the movies that were in that pool were being contested constantly by someone claiming to have a copyright. And yet, they were getting it done. And this is being repeated by other modern horror hosts across the country. I would meet both Miss Misery and Mr. Lobo several times over the years at horror film festivals and events, and I'd hear the very real struggles. Networks canceling shows, partnerships with independent channels that ended up in disappointment, issues with distributors, online videos being banned over new copyright disputes. The legendary horror hosts that they emulated never had to deal with any of this. I highly doubt many of the early guys would have put up with any of it. This was a side job. This was a lark. And yet, these new horror hosts just keep finding a new way to do what they want to do, no matter what the obstacle. Mr. Lobo's Cinema Insomnia has now been running longer than Creature Features, which was the show that inspired him. Miss Misery's Movie Massacre is still going strong on Roku, and Miss Misery has a comic book series. Raina Young, who's the alter ego to Miss Misery, also directed a documentary called Welcome to My Dark Side, Women in Horror. She also has a feature movie, Forgotten Tales. That's going to distribute worldwide in June of 2016 through SGL Entertainment. Horror hosts continue to be the square pegs in a business world that wants to believe there are only round holes. Years ago, I found out about live shows and events that were happening around the Bay Area that were themed around the subculture of B-movies and horror hosts. These shows would take place in local independent movie theaters, and they'd have themes like Godzilla movies or festivals around the TV show The Munsters. Sometimes they were live shows of the horror host showing a movie. Through these shows, I got to meet more horror hosts and other artists and stalwart fans who wanted to keep this form of entertainment alive. There's Lord Bloodraw, a short, stocky man in a top hat, tux and tails, spats, and a vest with a decorative skull motif. It's a look that's completed with a skull-topped cane and super arched painted eyebrows and a great bellowing laugh. He looks like he was drawn by Chuck Jones in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. He's often the master of ceremony to the live events, and he's very knowledgeable about the films he shows. He really loves them. His show, Lord Bloodraw's Nerve-Wrackin' Theater, is syndicated in California, Illinois, and Indiana. Then there's Sci-Fi Bob Ekman. He's a collector of films and memorabilia who's turned his passion into a show called the Psychotronic Film Show. He shows old horror movie coming attractions, health films, and commercials. And then there's Eric Yee. He's a talented artist who creates costumes like the robot from Forbidden Planet, Godzilla, Mothra, the 1958 version of The Fly, among others. He plays all the parts at live shows and somehow doesn't faint from heat stroke. I recently got to see all of these characters together at Creatures Con. It's a local 10-hour celebration of the old Creature Features television show. Former host John Stanley was on hand, and the late Bob Wilkins was there in spirit. In fact, Bob's son and daughter were on hand. As one might expect, they were treated as royalty. About 100 of us watched documentaries and old shows, and those old shows were complete with original commercials and interviews. There were kids there, a new generation watching and laughing. But most of us were older. This was the original fan base, coming back to snuggle up to the comfort of nostalgia. With that in mind, the end of the show was perfect. We ended with a broadcast sign-off of the Star-Spangled Banner, followed by white noise. Of course, the nostalgia is why you'll hear so many people say that their horror host was the best horror host out of them all. But not everyone felt that way. It's a confession I must make. My horror host drove me crazy. Maybe I need a support group. My midnight horror show was called Uncle Ted's Ghoul School. The host, unsurprisingly, was named Uncle Ted. Uncle Ted was played by Edwin Robb. He was working in television since the start of the affiliate stations. Uncle Ted wore a black tuxedo with a black and white striped ascot, a bright red fez, and a big bushy white mustache. He kind of looked like a low-rent version of Rich Uncle Pennybags, the cartoon character Monopoly, or an elderly version of the Pringles logo. Before there was a midnight horror show, Ed Robb had created the character of Uncle Ted for a children's show. Fresh off a success in children's daytime programming, Uncle Ted took the live midnight slot in 1974 for Uncle Ted's Ghoul School. I'm not really sure if he updated his act for an older audience. I'm not sure he updated it at all. The set of Uncle Ted's Ghoul School looked like a normal living room in northeastern Pennsylvania. There was a fireplace and a mantel and a picture hanging on the wall. There might have been a little bit of cobwebs. There was a rubber rat and a rubber hand. That was pretty much all the horror effects that you were going to see. Uncle Ted would enter through a door and welcome everybody to his show in a very deadpan voice. Uncle Ted didn't have a voice that really projected. Sometimes he'd just mutter like he was alone. Sometimes he sounded a little like Popeye when he was frustrated. In the center of the room was a table with a black cloth over it. This is where Uncle Ted would spend most of his time. And what he did there was practice magic. Practice. That's the key word here. Ted Robb's true love was magic. He actually took the Ghoul School job as a trade for free advertising for his magic shop. Every show was dominated by Uncle Ted trying to do magic tricks. And yes, he was a pull-a-rabbit-out-of-the-hat magician, a silk scarf magician. And for the love of God, he was terrible. He would do coin tricks, but the camera wouldn't go into a close-up, so you kind of had to take his word for it. He'd make something disappear, but you'd hear the item drop on the studio floor with a clatter. The rabbit in the hat trick? Sometimes a rabbit would appear in the hat, sometimes it wouldn't. Then there were the tricks I called rat and hand tricks. What would happen is that Uncle Ted would be struggling with a complex illusion, and suddenly the camera would just cut to a close-up of the rubber rat on top of the hand. A few seconds later, the camera would cut up just in time to see Uncle Ted complete the trick. Now, years later, I found out that a lot of that was shtick, and that Ted was really a pretty good magician when he would perform at live events. You could have fooled me. I mean, the tricks didn't fail broadly, they just kind of crumbled. And Uncle Ted didn't mug at the camera like a comedian. He'd just mutter in failure and tell a corny joke. I couldn't tell it was an act. Maybe Uncle Ted invented meta. All I know is I was exasperated. I don't think it's a good sign when a 10-year-old is yelling, "Idiot!" at the television. Hey, I was a serious horror guy, you know? My friends and I would gather in the elementary school playground every Monday, and we'd review the newest atrocities Uncle Ted committed on Friday night. Of course, we watched the next Friday. And every Friday. For years. It was really a love-hate relationship, because I still got scared watching the show. And I have to admit that I was scared by that Mystery Science Theater 3000 staple, The Brain That Wouldn't Die. I was sleeping over at my cousin's house the night The Brain That Wouldn't Die came on. If you've seen the movie, you know it's pretty absurd. A mad scientist brings his dead girlfriend's head back to life in a metal tray full of blood. Somehow, this gives her ESP and a really shitty attitude. But the scene that scared me was towards the end. There's this locked door in the back of the laboratory. Behind it, there's a monster, a failed experiment. Now, there's a mandatorily cruel assistant to the scientist who feeds the monster through a little hinged door at the top. The assistant is also deformed. His left hand only has fingers to the first knuckle. As one might expect, the monster finally reaches out and grabs the assistant and slowly rips his right arm off. Now, this is a black and white movie, but the black blood covers the entire right side of his lab coat. He climbs the stairs to the exit to get help, but his deformed hand can't turn the doorknob, and he slides down the stairs and bleeds to death. This was pretty extreme for Uncle Ted's Ghoul School, and it scared me because my cousin's bedroom had a closet door with a little door at the top, just like that one did, and we were going to have to sleep in that room. Suddenly, I was relieved to have Uncle Ted come on at the commercial break. He immediately failed at a steel ring illusion. Clang! And any fear and tension I had died with the magic trick. It turns out I needed Uncle Ted after all. Not that I'd ever admit it. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Who is your horror host? Tell me a story. If you like origination stories like the one in this podcast, there's a really good book I recommend. It's called Shock Value: How a Few Eccentric Outsiders Gave Us Nightmares, Conquered Hollywood, and Invented Modern Horror. It's by Jason Zinnemann. The book is available on Amazon, and it's also available as an audiobook on audible.com. For you, the listeners of Hellbent for Horror, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror. If you like the show and you're curious about audiobooks, sign up for the service through Hellbent for Horror. It helps make this podcast sustainable for me. I thank you in advance. That's audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror, and you can listen to Shock Value today. Thanks for listening, folks. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can subscribe to Hellbent for Horror on iTunes and Stitcher, and if you like the show, please consider writing a review on iTunes or Stitcher. It really helps. You can find more on our Facebook page at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and I'm on Twitter at Hellbent Horror. You can also find more info on my website, hellbentforhorror.com. Till next time, stay hellbent.